I'm Andrew Shearer, Director of Studies at the Lowy Institute, and with me today is Linda Jakobson, Director of the China and Global Issues Program at SIPRI. Linda, I wonder if you could explain for us why it is that China's behaving more assertively, whether it's with its naval power or its diplomacy towards its neighbours in the last 18 months or so.
The Chinese would say they've been more active in the foreign policy realm than ever before. And I suppose even some Chinese would agree that they've been more assertive. What's driving it? I think there's not an overwhelming, overarching good answer to that question. But part of the answer lies in the fact that pluralism has crept into the decision-making processes in China when it comes to foreign policy. There are now interest groups who all vie for an impact on foreign policy decision-making. The leadership is very unused to being under pressure, especially under pressure from, for example, the media, from internet, even from normal citizens writing in newspapers on how to conduct foreign policy. This is a very new phenomenon in China. And this leads to perhaps decisions being made at a lower level, which the top leadership is not necessarily always happy about or necessarily would themselves endorse. I think at least as far as some of the maritime incidents are concerned, the PLA has been out there making decisions on the spot in a way that they wouldn't have, let's say, 24 months ago. The PLA is certainly a debated new foreign policy actor at the moment in China. No one really knows how much influence it has. It's quite evident from the fact that PLA officers go live on TV and take part in televised debates about foreign policy. They show up at civilian workshops. They write quite actively on columns, opinion page columns in the newspapers. So at least parts of the PLA, for example, are trying to insert themselves in the foreign policy decision-making process. 10 years ago, this was unheard of. China is still very opaque when it comes to decision-making, but there is this element of pluralism creeping in. It's a new situation for the Chinese. Another explanation, I think, to your question is that many Chinese now see China as a major power, which I think it is, and feel that China should be more active in foreign policy. Outsiders might call it being assertive. They feel that China should also set the terms when it comes to foreign policy decision-making. They would like to see, many Chinese would like to see China take a much more assertive stance in dealing, especially with the United States, but with Western powers in general.
Your most recent research focuses on China's foreign policy making process and in particular the emergence of new foreign policy actors in China. Who are these new actors and how are they affecting the direction of China's foreign policy?
There are many kinds of new actors. There are new actors within the official foreign policy making establishment. For example, today the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is merely one actor in the process of making foreign policy, and not necessarily even the most important one or the most influential one. In addition to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's the Ministry of Commerce, very important, Ministry of Finance, National Development and Reform Commission, and so on. Then outside the official foreign policy making establishment, there are these new foreign policy actors. And in this SIPRI report, we identify as the most important ones the resource companies, especially in the energy sector. Interestingly, the resource companies sometimes inadvertently affect foreign policy decision-making. They're not out to influence foreign policy making, but with their actions overseas, they do end up entangling diplomats in this web of political debates, web of human rights issues, etc. So in addition to the resource companies, we've identified local governments, especially the provincial leaders in provinces along the coast, who have a stake in China's overseas activities, especially in trade and investment. Then we've identified the media and the netizens, all these very active bloggers who today would like to debate foreign policy issues openly, sometimes with success. Sometimes the Chinese government doesn't allow them to debate it so openly, but they are certainly forming a public opinion which in times of crisis can constrain the actions of the Chinese leadership. And then lastly, the big question is the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is that a new emerging foreign policy actor? Of course, traditionally, the PLA has always been part of the foreign policy making establishment. But after years, decades of reform, which is intended to distance the PLA from the political leadership, we've seen signs, especially, as you mentioned, in the last 18 months, of the PLA reinserting itself in the foreign policy decision-making process, wanting to set the agenda on issues which the PLA feels are important: national sovereignty, territorial integrity. And possibly, though it has not been said, of course, by the Chinese leadership, but there has been said by some PLA officials, the South China Sea. So I think the new foreign policy actors, generally speaking, has led to a fracturing of authority within the foreign policy decision-making processes. We also see, especially among the new foreign policy actors groups, a desire for Chinese leaders to more actively participate in the formulation of international affairs. Even there are groups who feel that China should set the agenda, set the terms when the West comes to China and wants China to participate in problem solving in a whole host of issues. This quid pro quo approach that we've seen actually in the last 18 months is something which I think is going to be a huge challenge for the outside world, especially Western countries. And I think the new foreign policy actors are pushing China in this direction to be more active. We might say be more assertive, be more demanding, and for the Chinese to set the international agenda.
What's your forecast for US-China relations over the next 1 or 2 years?
Well, Andrew, that's really a very difficult question. If we take as a benchmark exactly 1 year ago, when in November Barack Obama had concluded his first state visit to China as President of the United States, and things looked rather good at that point. I would say the relationship was on a rather level ground. From there, it's nearly only been a bumpy road, starting with the US announcement of new arms sales to Taiwan, President Obama meeting with the Dalai Lama, and so on and so forth. I think we're going to see a continuation of this rather bumpy road. I think it's inevitable that the sole superpower of the world is having to deal on a host of issues with this rising power, though I do like to say we shouldn't call China anymore a rising power. We should accept it as a major power. But I think the United States inevitably is going to have to take into account that China has its own demands, and China will want to, at least to a certain point, set the agenda on many of these issues that are so difficult to solve, even if we don't solve them, even just to deal with them. And I think that from the Chinese perspective, I see a need, especially in the maritime sphere, for the United States to give China just that 1 extra inch or centimeter, depending on what measurement one uses, of breathing space. I think China is not out to push the United States away from the Asia-Pacific region. I think actually China is very happy to have the United States there as a balancing power, also further than 1 or 2 years down the road. But China does, in its near vicinity, need a bit more breathing space as it becomes more aware of its own power. And I know, having just returned from Washington, that this is not something the Americans want to hear. For them, giving China breathing space is the same as appeasement. And to find a way to constructively discuss how to manage, for example, maritime issues, I think it's going to be very crucial already in the very short term between the United States and China. So I see a bumpy road ahead. But on the other hand, I'm not overly concerned about that relationship. The economic interdependence between the two countries is the glue that will keep the relationship stable. China needs the United States economically. The United States needs China. They are both very aware of that. Now, I haven't mentioned Taiwan. Taiwan is always there in the US-China relationship. At the moment, things are looking quite peaceful. I don't think in the next 1 or 2 years there's great reason for concern, but it will always be an issue between China and the United States. And of course, depending on what happens in 2012 in the Taiwanese elections, that will of course set the pace or set the stage for any possible new problems. But a rocky road, but on the other hand, interdependence, the realization on both sides that they need each other also.
What should Beijing be doing to ease the current security crisis on the Korean Peninsula following North Korea's shelling of the South Korean island?
I think China could do quite a lot of things. And just to begin with, China needs to publicly acknowledge that it disapproves of the North Korean shelling of a South Korean island. If we look back early in the year, when the South Korean vessel Chonan was sunk, according to an international investigation by a North Korean missile, the Chinese were silent. They were silent for days. And it was at the time when I was doing the SIPRI report research interviews, and it became quite evident the silence was due to the Politburo being divided on how to react to the sinking of this vessel. Consensus just couldn't be reached, consensus which is so important when Politburo makes decisions because of the unity of the Communist Party. And now again, after the shelling of the South Korean island by the North Koreans, China has been silent. China has only called for restraint from all sides. To be a credible partner of the international community, to be a credible player in the six-party talks or in any kind of six-party constellation dealing with the Korean Peninsula, China has to come out and criticize North Korea for its behavior. And we haven't seen this happen. So I think this is a very important first step. China is no longer a monolithic state. There are so many groups who all have their own opinions about how foreign policy should be conducted. There are certainly many groups on this issue who feel that China should behave internationally responsibly, be responsible in the international arena, and condemn North Korea when it deserves to be condemned. There are many groups within China who don't agree with the Chinese leadership's very timid stance, this inherent fear that any criticism might lead to events which would in turn lead to the demise of the present North Korean regime and a collapse of that state. The consequences, of course, for China are dire. There would be probably a mass influx of refugees, both to northeast China and also to South Korea. But this overarching fear of a collapse of North Korea has now put China in a position where it's losing respect of its neighbors, of its partners, and it's also crippling its ability to effectively manage the crisis. Now, in addition, I think China has made a constructive move and called for emergency talks. It's yet unclear, would these talks be six-party talks? After all, they were originally designed to deal with the nuclear, the dismantlement of the North Korean nuclear program, or would these be talks only focused on the present crisis? But I think that was a very constructive step. But it should be preceded by some kind of disapproval, which would be expressed by the Chinese government of the North Korean actions.
In what ways does the rise of China pose challenges for Australia?
Well, I think definitely, Andrew, China's rise poses challenges for Australia. There's no doubt about that. I think China's rise poses a great challenge for all nations in the Asia-Pacific and certainly probably beyond that as well. I think the Lowy Institute polls from earlier this year showing that while Australians are very much in favor of the good economic relationship that exists between China and Australia, they are increasingly worried where the rise of China is going to lead to as far as the security environment is concerned. In fact, I found it quite interesting but nearly startling that nearly half of Australians thought it might be probable or could be probable that China would pose a military threat to Australia within the next 20 years. So this discrepancy, this really is a challenge for Australian policymakers. But I think that Australia should concentrate very much on the fact that China needs Australia. China needs the resources that Australia can provide. They're vital for China's continued economic development, which after all is the premise on which the legitimacy of the Communist Party rests. So China will not pursue policies which jeopardize its relationships with partners who can provide some of these very vital resources. And of course, as China's economic development continues, it's going to need even more imported resources. So I think it does pose a challenge for Australia. I think that's evident, but I think it's a manageable challenge. I think the recent debate in Australia about what this rise of China actually means is very healthy. I think it's very good that everyone's taking a hard look at the changing environment that Australia is certainly finding itself in.
How should Australia manage this increasingly complex relationship with China?
Well, I'm not sure, Andrew, if I'm the right person to tell Australia policymakers how to manage this increasingly complex relationship, but I'd put forth at least as some ideas that Australian policymakers need to gain a much more nuanced understanding of how decisions are made in China in order to be able to formulate their own responses to some of the foreign policy decisions that affect Australia directly. China has become a very time-consuming partner, a very resource-consuming partner. It's a very complex partner, partly because of this per se positive development that there is a degree of pluralism within the foreign policy making establishment. But for example, it's important for Australian policymakers to know when a demand from China is the result of one interest group driving its own, perhaps quite narrow interests, or is a demand from China part of a much broader strategic objective that China is pursuing. And to gain that knowledge, I think one of the ways to balance the challenges that is involved in understanding the very opaque and complex system that China represents is to pool resources, to collaborate with allies, with Japan, with India in information gathering, communicating with them, trying to understand what's going on, and certainly with Australia's most important ally, the United States. Only by pooling resources, I think, can we, the rest of the world, deal with China at the moment, because it is such a time-consuming and resource-consuming partner. I think also in questions of value or questions of human rights, which are important to Australians, and it came out very well, I thought, in the Lowy Institute polls. I think because Australia is sort of in a lucky position that it is a valued partner because of its resources, it can push back and be clear to the Chinese that there are certain issues that are important to Australians, which Australians are not going to compromise on. And then in other issues, obviously, a middle ground has to be found. It's quite evident that this is not going to be an easy process. But I do think that it's possible to continue to have a constructive relationship with China. China's assertive behavior in the last 18 months has sort of led at least the Western media to already pronounce that China is becoming increasingly like a bully, or we're going to see an increase in the assertiveness that China has shown in its behavior. The verdict is still out. It could well be that the Chinese themselves realize that they've given the rest of the world a scare and China will pull back to a more moderate or balanced position. I think it's really too early to know what the China of 5 years from now is going to be like in its foreign policy behavior.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.